Today I'd like to talk a little bit about how the structural economic change that we've talked about in last lesson, how that economic change and the booms and recessions that kind of come with structural economic change impact people and places. So there was a Russian economist called Kondratieff who believed that the capitalist world went in these cycles of growth and decline. And these are 50-year cycles, and that they call them Kondratieff waves. So it basically meant that every time a new technology came along, then there was a rapid period of growth as that technology provided lots of economic opportunities and innovation, leading to a multiplier effect. And this changed places and people. And we can see that, on this graph. We're looking at when the invention of kind of water power, followed later on by steam power and the railways, how they would have had a huge impact on the various economies. But what Kondratieff says is when that technology becomes not so new, then that period of growth suddenly goes into a period of recession. So it's periods of growth followed by periods of recession, and they happen on 50-year cycles, roughly. So I'm going to relate this idea back to places that we've already talked about. If you look at these first three waves, this is an area that in the UK would have been about the industrial revolution and beyond. So if we look in this period, this is a period where machinery and improvements in textiles and railways and combustion engines, these all be massive innovations and advancements, and places that we've already talked about like Liverpool and Manchester and Sheffield would have all been places that would have had a lot of this innovation, and they would have been centres of the innovation, and therefore they would have had really positives in terms of economic opportunities, which meant that people had higher standards of living, and so these would have been areas of growth. But obviously, as we see with places, they don't stay the same, and they can change, and as these cycles have gone on, Manchester and Liverpool have been able to kind of respond to them, and in this manufacturing sector have been able to stay competitive. But then we get into this kind of period, fourth and fifth wave, and if we kind of look in this kind of 1970s and 1980s era for all of these cities, it was a time when, to make sure that these industries could stay technically competitive and innovative, they had to make changes, and that, as we saw in the last video, led to them shifting many of their manufacturing to other countries and making technological improvements, which meant that unemployment rose, so the employment numbers went down. Therefore, this would have had an effect on those places, and we see, quality of life, it goes down, standard of living goes down. So we need to know how these kind of changes in innovation and changes in the economy actually affect places. And a really good example of that is looking at how it affects the individual household. So if we get reduction in employment, then obviously there is less disposable income. And so because of that, that means that, we get less spending on services. And so in these areas, as we've talked before, we get this kind of demultiplier effect. And we actually get, people moving out of the area, less spending in the area, so we get job losses in the service sector. And how each place responds to these innovations really affects it. So while we might have had areas like Liverpool, Manchester and Sheffield that were struggling, there would have been other areas where in these new sectors, so we're talking biotechnology and we're talking about kind of IT, we would have had growth. So if you look at other parts of the world, if we look at places like Silicon Valley, we would have had huge growth, huge opportunities. And so the reverse would have happened. There would have been lots of investment. There would have been lots of raising standards of living. And therefore we get huge shifts from areas which go into massive decline, but it is often fed in with areas that have huge improvements. Last thing really to mention in this is that places aren't static. And that means that different players can have an impact in changing how a place responds to these kind of cycles of boom and bust. And so if we look at places like Liverpool and Manchester, both of them have had kind of, investment with from different areas. So Liverpool has had investment from EU in terms of the structural adjustment plans. And that means they have helped build a science park, which is trying to kind of get into the latest area innovation. This is where all the growth and jobs are. Manchester has become one of the highest tech growth industries areas in the whole of Europe, and I'm going to show you a short clip that kind of proves that in a second. So how governments respond to this and how cities respond to it shows that while an area can go through a period of huge recession and change, how the implementations and the kind of techniques that are used to get them out of it might lead to a reversal of the conditions.
Manchester, famous for Industrial Revolution, famous for sport and famous for music. But what about tech? It may not be the first city that comes to mind when you think of the world's top technology hubs, but Manchester's tech scene is growing and already boasts some impressive success stories. Accommodation booking site Late Rooms, fashion e-tailer Boohoo, and e-commerce site Autotrader, and many more all call Manchester home. So what exactly does Manchester have to offer burgeoning tech companies? To find out, I headed to Manchester Science Partnership's Central Campus, home to over 170 companies in sectors including life science, health tech and ICT.
Science and technology are driving the growth of our economy, and they're young and growing sectors. And so part of the role that we play is to support those young businesses, working with them to understand where there are gaps in the supply chain, where there are gaps in skills and knowledge and resources, and then working with them and with other stakeholders to fill those gaps.